Councillor Davies, you answer the gentleman. Are you happy now? Do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity for us to read through the amended amendments. I don't know if that's a phrase. I suppose it's really just a kind of plea for me, really. I know, colleagues have been around a long time. I think it would be helpful in future if the wording of these resolutions and amendments are checked out with the Director of Law to ensure that they are legal, so that we don't have to, waste time and reread revised amendments and revised motions. I think that would be helpful, and clearly, we've got the skills within the departments, or in the council and in the departments with the law to give advice to members. So I hope we can avoid this kind of process in the future. Thank you.
Well, I thought that this had all been agreed, actually, Councillor, so there we go. Okay, we all now agree, the three parties. Councillor Harney, Councillor Green.
Yes.
Just go ahead now with the motions after that. Right. So we're going to go to motion number 1 first, are we? And that is Phil Davies. Right, okay. Oh, yes, if we get some more advice on this.
Perhaps, Mr. Mayor, just to assist that, certainly I understood, and I think it would make sense if we have the first 3 resolutions, bearing in mind what Phil said, we did also then look at the 3. We'd have the first, so we'd have proposed in the second for the first 3 resolutions, 1 debate, and then a separate vote at the end. I thought that was, is that the approach we're taking?
That seems to be agreed. Councillor Harney, is that up to your satisfaction?
Well, it was my understanding that that was already agreed, Mr. Mayor, so if that's the case, then that's the case.
That's what I thought as well. Yeah, that's agreed. Okay, so Councillor... Yes. Okay, go ahead. Okay, Councillor Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Rising to move the resolution in my name, seconded by Councillor McLachlan, on meeting our budget challenge. Mr. Mayor, I understand the temptation. We could spend a long time this evening talking about, who might be to blame for the budget challenge that we're facing. And, I'll be upfront to declare my party's position is that we disagree with the government's kind of national policy around austerity, and particularly the impact it's having on local government. However, I think the key question for us this evening, the one that I'd like to address, is rather than try and score political points, how can we make sure that we do close the budget shortfall, both in this financial year and the £100 million savings over the next 3 years? And whilst we may quibble with the precise numbers, I think nobody who attended the visioning day we had at the Floor Pavilion last month, where we had, I think, 2 excellent speakers, Professor Travers from the London School of Economics, Carolyn Downs, the Local Government Association, could be in any doubt that this council, in common with many other authorities, particularly in the north of England, do face unprecedented cuts in the money that we're going to be getting from central governments over the next 3 years, and we really do need to fundamentally rethink how we deliver local services. As I said when I became leader, achieving budget and financial stability was one of our key priorities. In fact, I think it's our top priority, and I'm glad that this is also a central theme of our improvement plan. But I think, one of the good things about the way we've approached this is the new approach we've developed to budget setting. Firstly, I believe we have a new rigour in the whole budget setting process, and I pay tribute to our interim director of finance, who's now producing monthly revenue and capital monitoring reports that all members can check on where things are up to on the budget. And the interim director is also working with other chief officers to better understand how budgets have been constructed in the past and to ensure that we have sustainable budgets going forward. And he has highlighted issues which I think do need to be addressed. I mean, for example, we have hits in a number of areas unrealistic income targets. We have savings which have not been delivered. We have a number of services or activities which consistently overspend. And we have one-off funding which is used consistently to balance the budgets. And we know from the briefing note which the interim director has, I think, helpfully produced for all members this evening, that the council's budget in 11-12 had an underlying problem and an overspend of 14.6 million. And that was met from the one-off reserves that I mentioned. And we simply cannot continue preparing budgets on that basis. And I think we need to take strong and decisive action. And let me make it clear, I'm not pointing the finger at any one particular group or any one particular officer. These are structural problems in the way we've done budgeting over a number of years. But the key thing is we need to learn from these mistakes and put sound budget setting procedures in place. I do think that the new process is more open and more transparent. For example, we published the timetable for consultation and the timetable for making decisions. It's in the papers that Council this evening, and I outlined it in my reply to Councillor Gilchrist earlier on. A key element is that we will publish a list of saving options which will be available for discussion with our residents, and scrutiny committees can also contribute. And I'd like to take the opportunity of thanking our community engagement team for the excellent work they've done around the What Really Matters initiative, the biggest consultation exercise that we've done. In the 4 weeks so far, it's reached more than 11,000 people, 110 events across Wirral, and we've received 4,000 completed questionnaires, with still 5 days to go before the process is complete. Let me turn briefly, Mr. Mayor, to the immediate in-year problem, the 2012-13 overspend, which now comes to somewhere 15.3 million in the latest monitoring report. I believe that having been made aware of this overspend, the administration simply had a responsibility to take urgent action, and therefore I think the Cabinet on the 6th of September is absolutely the right thing to do, that we impose a freeze on all non-essential expenditure. I also think it was right to use 7 million of unallocated reserves to help bridge the gap in this year's budget. And what I do find difficult to understand is those resolutions which we are debating later on, which ask for us to review these changes that we've made, these amounts that we've decided to contribute to the debate, but don't say, well, if we didn't do this, what other things would replace? How else would we bridge the budget gap and the shortfall? I think every member has a responsibility, if they're suggesting that we spend money on a particular service or a particular set of issues, that they say, well, if we're not going to save the money there, what else are we going to save the money on? And I think, sadly, I think the other motions that we're talking tonight are pretty silent on that. We've also imposed a similar freeze on capital spending, and we're particularly looking at schemes with unsupported borrowing, which clearly have revenue implications going forward. And I don't accept the point that this has all been done in secret behind closed doors. All the items that we've looked at as a Cabinet are on the agenda for the Cabinet on Thursday, and will be subject to the normal scrutiny process. I must just comment, and I know this is, we're going to come back to this later on, but with regard to the neighbourhood funding, contrary to the notice of motion moved by Councillor Green, this funding has not been cut. It has been suspended while we review the budget and make sure we can balance the books at the end of the year. And I'm pleased to say that in terms of one of the key items, the 20-mile-an-hour schemes, we've got an amendment later on the agenda which releases some money, some 220,000 immediately, so that every area forum can spend £20,000 on road safety measures, which could include 20-mile-an-hour zones if they so wish. And finally, Mr. Mayor, on the advice of the Chief Exec, we are undertaking an urgent restructuring of senior management within the authority. Contrary to the perception from some of the other resolutions we've got on the agenda tonight, this will save money for the Council. This will not be a net cost. And I've had assurance from the Chief Executive, who I know is confident that this will generate significant savings. So in conclusion, Mr. Mayor, I've set out our approach to the budget challenge that we face. The cornerstones of that is to have a robust methodology, open Clearly, over the next few months, we will have to make difficult decisions. I give a pledge that I'm happy to continue working as far as we can across party lines to try and find solutions to this. And bodies I've set up, such as the Leaders Board, which now meets monthly, met last Friday, and the Improvement Board and Scrutiny Committees will help with this task. So in closing, Mr Mayor, I hope I've demonstrated the responsible way in which this administration is going about dealing with our budget challenge. And can I thank all members for the constructive way, particularly through the scrutiny workshops that we've had, that they've engaged. And I ask Council to support this motion. Thank you.
I'm advised that we take the amendments proposals first before we take items 2 and 3. So that's the amendment. Is Councillor Green. Is that right?
Mr. Mayor, much as...
Just give me Councillor Green, I'm just going to take a bit more advice.
Okay, I was just going to try and help Mr. Mayor.
Yes, please.
Which was, much as I'm sure everyone would like to hear 3 speeches from me, 3 speeches from Bill, 3 speeches from Tom. I think just one dealing with the 3 items would probably be the easiest.
Okay. So, is that going to be agreed that the proposal amenders, you've only got 1 speech each of items 1, 2 and 3. So that would take us to the amendment for item 1, which is Councillor Green.
Okay. So this, just to be clear, Mr. Mayor, I'll speak to the notice of motion being moved. I'll try and cover some of the issues that were in the amendment. So, not wishing to excite people too much, we do still have our opportunity for the right to reply. Mr. Mayor, first thing I do is to welcome Phil to the real world of doing budgets. I remember standing here being excoriated for having a consultation exercise, and you've only had so many people answer it and so on, which I think was more than you've had so far with this one, but I welcome you to the idea of engaging and involving with the public. I also remember standing here when we were proposing large amounts of reductions in spending and having to allow so many people to leave the authority, being attacked and accused that this wasn't necessary and somehow it was being made up. Clearly, reality has bitten, and Councillor Davies is now aware of what the real world is and decisions that have to be taken. And I would just reassure him also that I believe we all, this Council, are still in this together. We all have that problem. We all deserve to bring our what talents we have and what ideas we have to the job of bringing the Council, putting the Council on a sustainable track, particularly its budget and so on, because if we can't get the budget right, then all the other services that we have to deliver will fall by the wayside. I think the key issue for me, Phil and Mr. Mayor, is how we're going to approach this. And I think what we have to do is to approach it with honesty as far as the public is concerned and transparency about the actual situation we've got. So, for instance, this current approach that we have that says we've got 100 million to find over 3 years, that's all because of government cuts. Clearly, that's not the case. And the Director of Mr. Timmins, who I find him a breath of fresh air and very entertaining to engage with in terms of these matters. He does point out in his note to me, that's you done, Peter. I know how to finish your career. What he makes out very clearly in his note to me and to others is, in fact, funding reduction over grants over the next 3 years is going to be something like 35 million, but projected expenditure, so the Council's own projected expenditure is 68 million. So clearly there is an issue not simply about the reductions in support that the Council are getting, because as everyone knows, the government was left with the public services and the public finances in a mess. There is also increased demand that the Council itself is proposing to take. So we have to deal with the 2 issues in terms of those budget pressures that are already in the system, and then also the issue with regards come to the other element within our objection, which is, of course, the whole business about looking at the strategic change programme. One of the elements that I've seen in this budget, in terms of the overspending, a whole series of items that look vaguely familiar. So what I did was, I went back to have a look at the Labour Party budget that they proposed. And then I looked at the element of that which was in the strategic change programme that the Labour Party proposed. If you remember, people will remember this, I think, that in September, the then leadership of the Labour group made changes into who ran the strategic change programme, various senior appointments. And one of the things they did was the responsibility of the strategic change programme. And they accepted this as they came through. And I was having a look at this Labour's own strategic change programme. And the list of overspend, there is a remarkable correlation between overspends and the fact that the strategic change, Labour's own strategic change programme, hasn't been delivered. So to call them overspends, yes, but what it really is benefits not being delivered and no indication of how they're being delivered. And that's why, in this resolution, and at the time we made this point, we needed to have an all-party view, an oversight, and a driving forward of the strategic change programme. And that's why we made that argument at the time, and why I still believe the first decision of the new Labour cabinet to wipe all that away and to say, no, we're not going to bother, is part of the reason we're in this situation 6 months on. Now, I don't do that to make a party political point, Phil. I just do it on the basis of experience and how we need to work together and to make sure these services are delivered. I think that was a mistake. I think it was foolish, and actually, I've said so. And then finally, Mr. Mayor, the other concern that we have is, of course, certainly this group believed and believes that it was important to engage communities in the services and priorities for their area. That was what the funding for the local area forums was about, as well as giving direct funding. It was also giving the power to influence and to shape the resources that the council has in place. And they were key elements of what we were seeking to do. And I was concerned and incredibly disappointed that at a stroke, the administration and the Office of Pat decided that that was non-essential spending. It was no longer anything that needed to be supported, and that decision came out actually on an email. We were told that had been stopped. And I think that was the wrong way to go about it, Mr. Mayor, and I do think if we are to be inclusive and involved, that perhaps there could have been some discussion about priorities and where we went. And then when I tested that even further, it was unclear about what else had been stopped. It was unclear about what we were told was an appeal mechanism. How did that appeal mechanism work? Who was putting it forward? And so now I am pleased to see that after some fairly robust discussions, that there is on the supplemental agenda of the Cabinet a list of the decisions that were taken and who has actually which have been agreed and which not. So I'm pleased to see that's been brought forward. But we still don't know what's not been brought forward, what's not being spent, we haven't been told about. And I am assured, because again we raised that will come. And I think we need to see the transparency of what is being brought forward and what is not being brought forward and what's being stopped and why. And that's where this resolution came from. And I know things move on and I welcome some of the changes being made, but we need to make sure there is that greater transparency about what's being done and what isn't. So, in conclusion, Mr. Mayor, I think that getting away from the strategic change programme was a mistake. I'm delighted to see that you have now accepted that and have put Mr. Timmins onto the job, which I'm sure he will do with great aplomb. I'm delighted that you're waiting to hear the results of the consultation exercise, and we'll use that in terms of working with the Grain. conclude once more. The amendments in our name, I think, is the right one. I think the administration should take notice of it and the approach that we are outlining and learn from the mistakes that we pointed out to them are making, and I commend it to the council.
Thank you. I think the next amendment was Councillor Brighouse. You're next.
Thank you.
So we're doing the three amendments first, there's two amendments. Well, the first advice I had was that I was going to do the amendments first, but you're now saying we're doing the third item next. Okay, in that case it's Councillor Harney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I would like to really talk about substantial issues. So I
Just introduce Councillor Davies. Do you want to raise it? Sorry, Mr. Councillor Harney. The advice I've been given is we're taking items 1, 2 and 3 and we're now on number 3. Okay, you happy? That's the advice. Do carry on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I shall start next then. I am trying to resist the temptation to go through a sort of a story about what has been happening in the last few days, and my attempt, which I did make, to share with the other parties when I got them the changes, shall we say, that were suggested, and I won't even comment upon what my comments were when I compared the wording on our motions and the wording in the suggested changes. So I won't do that, although I think people might look at them and see how important or whatever they are. However, there is, Mr. Mayor, a very important question I would like to rehearse, and that is this. Really, I think we're focusing upon this year, the in-year problems that we're going to have. And although we might say that we should look forward and not look backward, I think the ratepayers, council taxpayers rather, and the people who might expect us to do both and have a fairly convincing story as to what's going on. I won't go back to 1974, Mr. Mayor, but I'll go back just 2 years. And that is that at that time, if you remember, there were about over 1,000 people who left the service of this council. And the assumption was that would, in fact, because we weren't going to pay them anymore, and the termination costs were capitalised, which meant we borrowed the money with government permission, that in fact that is an amount of money which we quantified and discussed, which would be a saving. I believe, well, the question then is this large amount of money, what happened? I have approached and you forgive me if I call the interim director of finance simply the director of finance and so on. It gets very confusing with all of these titles. I have spoken to the director of finance who invited me to ask him to write a paper on it. So I've done that, and no doubt when he's written it, he can share it with the whole council, and that I would feel is an appropriate way forward. Because, Mr. Mayor, somehow or other this amount of money seems to have evaporated somewhere, and it was a very substantial amount of money, and but we entered the following financial year, the budget, which my colleague over there wrote, or the office of his assistants perhaps, and we assumed and were given the legal advice, that in fact that was a robust, I believe the present word is, budget. That was the advice that we got. When it comes to this year, no doubt most people here, those who are members, remember what happened, but again, there were various motions put forward, one from each party, and we have advice from, again, the minutes I've read show that there were committees that were in fact properly monitoring it. They were asking questions, short of setting themselves up as part-time accountants. I'm not sure what they do, but certainly it was monitored and questions were asked. But the question now is what we do now. Well, we have to ensure we redouble our efforts, I would suggest, to do this monitoring. So, being positive, as Councillor Davies suggested, I would like to make some comments. And the first one is maybe we should think about, and we have done a lot, but we need to redouble our efforts to make sure that when Council discusses these issues, and this is a Council issue, then we have to have debates which are properly informed and organised and so on. That is a challenge, since when we've had the same pattern more or less since 1974, but nevertheless we have to move forward because we're in a new century, I'm told. I do think that the Democracy Working Party needs to meet again to discuss the issues about the best way in which we can ensure that all members know what is going on. And I also... Oh, sorry. I'll finish now. And secondly, going on to the positive things that Phil suggested, and I suggest also that the members' training group in particular and other interested parties consider the best way of actually both briefing and discussing with members the ongoing finances so that we don't just hear these huge numbers, but we actually have some idea what is behind them, how we can check them, and what has gone on. Because we might satisfy ourselves, but I am sure that over the coming months, the public of Wirral will expect us to justify ourselves to them, and that is our duty. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Now, you can surely appreciate and sympathise with me. I'm taking advice on this complicated. 3 motions are being discussed at once, and 3 separate amendments. But I understand I'm advised that Councillor Brighouse, you are now invited to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sometimes quite difficult when you're a councillor on Wirral Council. I've only been on for a relatively short period of time. But when I came on, after about 3 months, this wonderful financial monitoring statement appeared, and I opened it, and there were all these wonderful things about, well, they weren't wonderful at all, there were all these frightening things that other sorts of services have to feel problems. And then somewhere in there was comments about car parking revenue with no end of course, and dear old golf courses are not doing very well. So I expected that straight away there'd be some major changes would take place. And it came as something of a surprise when a week or so later it goes through the Cabinet and the report is simply noted. And then last year, it's virtually a repeat performance of the same event. So much so that this year, when the monthly monitoring, financial monitoring statement came through, I actually deleted it without opening it. Because I just thought, I know what to say, and I know we won't do anything about it. But this year was different. And we certainly did make changes. And it was right that we should make changes. I don't have any problem with the fact that we reacted to the deficit that we were faced with. And again, for the sake of absolute clarity on this, I'm as keen as anybody that we should reduce days of using reserves to balance the budget, they're gone. We've got to do it now, in year, out of the way we operate. So it therefore comes as a little bit of a surprise when what I find is we've set up a star chamber. We've added another layer of bureaucracy. You now have to fill a form in by Tuesday afternoon that goes to a committee and various things. That we appear, and that to me isn't really making a stronger corporate centre. It's almost a sign of weakness because we're not trusting people, we're not trusting our employees to make decisions about finding a way through, about designing a council that is sustainable. Only whenever it was, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we all, or most of us, went to the Floral Pavilion. And the absolute number one aim at the Floral Pavilion, which everybody would agree with, and certainly I would not dispute in any way, the number one aim was that we had to do something about the difference in life chances and between the life expectancy between the different parts of the borough. So it then comes as something of a shock when one of the first things, a relatively small item of expenditure designed to help those people living in the most deprived areas of the borough, that is lost in this new star chamber system, this new bureaucratic system. There's a reasonable likelihood that we'll actually finish this year with a greater general fund than the minimum that we require. And many would say that's a good idea. But just remember, it's raining and the roof is leaking. This isn't the time to put money aside for a rainy day. What we do need to do is to design a council that can live within its budget. We don't need this sort of this slightly interesting bureaucratic system that we've put in place. And the sooner we concentrate on the real task of developing this council, the better. And just in connection with that, we are valued for money. The Audit Commission recently qualified our value for money audit, and they did that because we haven't got a plan in place. One of the reasons they did it, at least, was because we haven't got a plan in place to reduce our expenditure over the next 2 to 3 years. And a star chamber is not a plan for a sustainable council. So just finally, Mr. Mayor, in conclusion, can I just say this? I wouldn't expect, don't take my word for it, but I know you've been very busy trying to run the council and make all these savings. But I would ask, particularly members of the Labour group, listen to the speech that Ed Balls made at the Labour conference. Because there's a number of very interesting points in there. And one in particular, I thought, he put forward a proposal, it was quite interesting, he put forward a proposal about what we should do with the mobile phone licences and how we should take that revenue and use it to provide some growth within the economy, to some demand. We've got a fairly modest measure in Wirral to do with broadband. Okay, we don't need it, but we should be using that money in a positive way.
Councillor Brighouse, the red light is on. And nobody has proposed an extension. We're going to, all the proposals have spoken and the amendments have spoken, so now it's open to the council. Councillor Hale.
I want to make just 2 main points, Mr. Mayor. The letter we received from the Section 151 officer was very sensible in virtually all parts, in my opinion. But I draw your attention to paragraph 2.7, which says the balances are a one-off funding resource. The council's policy is to have a balance
balance of 6 million. It then goes on to the final paragraph, which reads, the last sentence, any suggestions for proposals for increased spend is unlawful, both absolutely and relatively, by taking the balances below the policy level. Well, in actual fact, I discussed this with the Director of Finance immediately before Council, and I think it was agreed between us that that is not strictly true. If it went below nil, then obviously that would mean we're in an overspend position, and that would be illegal. But in actual fact, if you have, as the previous paragraph said, a policy of 6 million, you can certainly cut that if you wish to. I make this point, it's an important point, because if in fact we recover the overspend in the current year, by whether it's the use of finding savings, whether it's the use of reserves, whatever, and we have balances left, I think the first call on those balances is to restore the neighbourhood funds. Mr. Mayor, I just want to say a few words about the amendment in Phil Davies' name about austerity. In the summer of 2008, it was known that the British deficit and the country's deficit was huge. In fact, by 2010, it was in excess of 800 billion. We were spending 70 billion a year on interest alone, and of course, we were probably facing, if we did nothing, what Greece and other countries have faced. Mr. Mayor, we had no choice as a country but to face the fact that we had to reduce expenditure. Now, whilst we might all have views on how that to be achieved, we haven't heard one suggestion yet from the National Labour Party as to how it can be achieved. Every proposal put forward by the government, across all departments, including local government, police, welfare, transport, each one has been opposed. We've had nothing positive at all from the other side. So I think, have we got a point to make, Harry? I thought we were moving another 5 minutes on you, so I could say quite a lot on this subject.
Harry, through the chair, please.
Mr. Mayor, there was one honest member in the government, or even half honest, and I'll tell you why. He left a note in the desk, Liam Byrne, the former Chief Secretary for the Treasury. He said, there's no money left. It's half honest, because what he didn't say was, by the way, the deficit is now £800 billion. Mr. Mayor, I think, as far as I know, through a long political career and reading books, there has never been a Labour government that didn't leave a mess that an incoming government didn't have to deal with. And therefore, I'm very interested, Mr. Mayor, when I was watching television, a couple of weeks ago, I was searching for a comedy show and inadvertently found myself watching the Labour conference, which I found even funny. And it had a slogan, Labour to rebuild Britain. I think there's some justice in that, after all, he demolished it in the first place.
Okay. Councillor Kenny.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to bring us back to the debate we're having tonight in this council chamber. First of all, Chair, I actually support motion number 1. And I know you mentioned at the beginning about the number of councillors who have been here for 21 years or more, but I doubt if there's anybody in this council chamber tonight who's ever been in such a serious financial situation or dealt with it as the one we're in tonight. And I think we've got to take it seriously. Because first of all, this council has received a report on the revenue budget based on the last 3 months. And whether we like it or not, if urgent action is not taken, we could face as a council an overspend of almost £17 million by the end of the current financial year. Now, immediate action has been required, which includes freezing, not withdrawing or cutting, freezing all non-essential spending and releasing reserves that we no longer require. And Mr. Mayor, doing nothing in respect of this year's budget is not an option. That would be grossly irresponsible, and more than that, it would be illegal if you read the note that the acting interim director of finances put out last week, because in that he stated, and I'll quote Mr. Mayor, the council's revenue budget at month 5 is projecting an overspend of £15.3 million for 2012-13, an overspend that exhausts the balances and which results in the council budget having a deficiency is unlawful. And I would suggest, Mr Mayor, that if this council ignored that advice from the interim director, we'd be doing so as ourselves. Now, the necessary decision has already been taken to suspend the Neighbourhood Funding Grants Programme. And the first point to make is, despite some of the propaganda that I've seen put out in various parts of the borough by Conservative newsletters, etc., and also the amendments, even the latest amendment put forward by the Conservatives tonight, the funding has not been cut or withdrawn, and as I understand it, the current amendment before us still refers to withdrawal. It's been suspended until we as a council are in a position to make a definite decision on whether or not we can afford to pay for those services. Now, all members will be very much aware that we're in the middle of a major budget consultation which aims to talk to everyone with an interest in how the Wirral goes forward in the future, on the basis that we need to save £100 million, a third of the budget, over the next 3 years. Now, my view is quite plain. I don't think the Tories will agree with me, but the reason we're having to do that is because of cuts imposed by the Tory-led government at national level. And also, Mr Mayor, if you look at the Tory amendment tonight, I think it's very confusing. First of all, paragraph 2 in their amendment refers to 67 million. I'm not sure exactly how that figure of 67 million is reached. Also, Mr Mayor, on the actual amendment itself, it doesn't actually state which parts of our motion it's seeking to delete or which new parts it's seeking to put in. So it's very confusing if you take it literally as an amendment. Also, yeah, I'll take the rest of that, Mr Mayor. Looking at their amendments, it doesn't seem to accept that the £100 million is as a result of government cuts. Well, if it isn't, what is it then? I don't think it's a figure that we on this side have just plucked out of the air. And it then goes on again to talk about the withdrawal under paragraph 4. And I want to make clear, Mr Mayor, this funding has been suspended pending a review. Finally, Mr Mayor, if you look at the Lib Dem amendments, which none of them appear to have spoken to during the debate, it talks about deleting 4A and 4B. Well, all that would do is just to try and pretend that we haven't got a problem. Mr Mayor, we've got a real problem as a council. We've got a problem now. We've got to deal with it collectively as a council now, and that's why I'm urging everybody to support motion number 1. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Johnston.
Right, I'll do my best to speak to the amendments, okay? I'm intrigued by the mixed messages that are coming out of the revenue freeze. The Leader of the Council, in his motion, refers to the purpose of the freeze being this: to help bridge the budget gap from this year. However, I'd like to refer you to page 51 of our council papers. This is a report by Peter Timmins. Page 51, point 12, 2E. Peter Timmins asks us as elected members to agree that the revenue savings resulting from the spending freeze will increase the general fund balances in preparation for the rise in the level of risk in 2013-14. So there's a confusing message here. We're being told on one hand the freeze is just to deal with the problems this year, and then on the other hand we're being told that no, actually we want to make greater savings so that we're in a better position for next year. We're also told that our budget is in danger of being illegal unless we start to take immediate and drastic measures. I would like to draw attention to the supplementary agenda item going to Cabinet, the revenue monitoring report. Page 8, point 7.1. This part of the report correctly reflects that at the end of the year we are aiming to have £6 million in the general fund balances as per the Blue Book. That's an agreed position that we're in. The table then below goes to paint the picture as we stand right now. And the picture it paints is that even if we overspend by £15.7 million, we will still end up with a general fund balance at the end of the year of £5.7 million. Okay, so that's without any remedial action at all. If we just stay as we are right now, at the end of the year we will have £5.7 million in the general fund budget. That is a shortfall of
£300,000. We can deal with that with our eyes closed, can't we, surely? This basically shows that the transfer of £7 million from the Neighbourhood Working Fund has put the budget back into balance, excusing the small change of £300,000. Therefore, why on earth are we being asked to freeze a whole lot of items that are very precious to our communities? Neighbourhood funding, 20-mile-an-hour zones, payments of £250 to our lowest members of staff, road safety schemes, green growth initiatives, improving our play areas, and perhaps most worryingly of all, a freeze to hold off £13,000 worth of spend on new furniture for the Chief Executive's suite. The figures speak for themselves. The budget is back in balance if we use that £7 million as you see fit. The budget is back in balance apart from £300,000. I would therefore like to hear the justification for this freeze. Thank you.
Okay, the next one is Wendy, Councillor Wendy Clements.
Mr Mayor, once upon a time I gained a degree in maths, and you may know that pure mathematicians, Mr Mayor, don't deal much in numbers, unlike accountants and people like that. But even mathematicians can do simple addition, subtraction and so on when the need arises. So at the recent scrutiny workshop I was very interested in the slide from the Interim Director of Finance titled £100 million. It clearly lays out that over the next 3 years the funding drops from around 273 million to around 252 million. In which world does that mean we've lost a third of our income? So Mr Mayor, I wondered why is the council website and every library showing a video which portrays the leader of the council saying, at the moment, we think that in 3 years' time we'll have £100 million less to spend on services. And then he says, imagine the choices you face if you were told a third of the money you had to live on was being taken away. That's the situation we're facing. Mr Mayor, I do think that's misleading. There are real issues to me in the way these figures are being presented. 1/3 of our money is not being taken away. For sure, we do have problems to balance our budget, but let's be transparent, as the motion to council says. For many of the people in my ward, or the rest of Wirral, these detailed figures aren't readily available. They wouldn't know where to go to find them. So they rely on the headline numbers that they've been so promoted in the press or in the libraries and such like. So to be an open and transparent council is a wonderful aspiration. We need to work together to achieve that and challenge each other on it. Strive not to be in the firing line for the Radio 4 programme More or Less, which looks at public reports and questions them when they're misleading or inaccurate. Mr Mayor, when the Cabinet's reached its decisions about the budget next year, then the scrutiny committees will be better able to scrutinise them. And our terms of reference do state first that we will review and or scrutinise decisions made or actions taken. Mr Mayor, I've not been asked yet about any more scrutiny committee meetings, and I do hope we get to discuss that very soon because it would appear that we're going to be very busy. It's vital that this council uses its money to wisely benefit the people of Wirral. Decisions need to be very transparent. Let's be sure that all the available money doesn't disappear into council offices, but is spent on in our local communities, where relatively small sums can make a big difference to the lives of the people who live there. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Foulkes.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and can I congratulate the leader of the council for actually doing something that hasn't been done for a considerable period of time in this authority, and that is grasping the net firmly by the stem and moving forward with this council. Just a bit of a history lesson, Tom and other people who made contributions. The last 2 budgets set by this council have been set by a combination of Conservative councillors and Liberal Democrat councillors. Last 2 budgets. If there's an inherent fault in the budget, then I suggest you look a bit closer to your own homes, your own parties, where that inherent weakness may be. The last 2 budgets have been set by a combination of Conservatives and force this council into illegality. If that's not the case, and you were convinced what you were moving was legal, why did you change them? Because you were wrong and found to be wrong. So there's the football analogy, the crowd would be singing, you don't know what you're doing at the moment. That's what the crowd would be singing. You've picked out on a very drastic measure, and I accept that, but it is a drastic measure that's been advised by the leading officers of the council, along with the senior politicians, to take now a freeze on non-essential spending. That's what's happened. Now, there's other non-essential spending that you're not making a song and dance about. There's also inherent faults in the budget, which is coming to the recognition of Cabinet in the future reports. But you are picking, as ever, those that have some little, popularity with the public. Area forum grants, great. Don't give us lessons about the area forums. This administration created them. This administration gave them the money initially to spend. It was this administration that created UDSI. We don't need lessons about promoting area forums and the things that are behind that. What we did set up, though, when we first set it up, and we need to review this seriously, we set it up as a part of a job of an existing officer. What's happened within the area forums, and we all have to accept it, we now have a fairly big management system back in that area forum. Is that the best use of our money? If we freeze and don't spend, that gives us a chance to refocus. We are in the very, very start, or hopefully, we could, just think about it, if we, as the elected members, made 1, 2, 3 priorities the aim of this council, and then we began to focus around them, wouldn't we want the opportunity to say to the community, help us in these 3 priorities, and the grants will be awarded to help achieve those priorities, rather than then just simply being used on various schemes. I am informed, Mr. Mayor, that some area forums have not even spent last year's allocation of funding. So let's be serious about this. Don't try and play the politics game. Don't try and play the popular appeal. You tried to tell the people of Wirral we were in such a great financial position we can actually give the money back. We were actually going to give money back to people who had never paid a penny county tax for their lives. If that's not right, if that's not telling the truth, I don't know who is. I will not have a partnership with the party opposites. We are genuinely trying, and the leader, Phil, is genuinely trying to engage with all the parties. So don't pick your pet schemes just yet. That will come at budget making. That will come when the elections start. Let's get this budget in shape, and let's back the leader of the council.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Quite clearly, Mr. Mayor, Council has to act responsibly and cannot spend money it does not have. But I believe that the recent decision of Cabinet, such as to cut or suspend neighbourhood funding and the 20 miles per hour schemes when they have been funded and agreed as council policy, has been a serious error of judgment and a betrayal of trust in Wirral Council. During this time of fiscal austerity, Council needs the support and cooperation of the residents of Wirral more than any other time. Those people who are positively encouraged to apply for funding are the very people Council needs to work with. The very varied voluntary sector, social enterprises, the people who give freely of their time to work to enhance the well-being of people of all ages and for the improvement of the environment. These people applied in all good faith and now feel deflated and bitterly disappointed. It is galling, Mr. Mayor, that the decision to implement 20 miles per hour schemes has been deliberately stalled over a long period of time. This despite numerous petitions being submitted to Council and the Finance Committee to go ahead with the schemes. Now, yet again, the expectations of our constituents have been kicked into the long grass. Labour will obviously blame the coalition government for the current financial problems facing Wirral and indeed the country. I will just remind Council that if the millionaire Tony Blair had not taken us to war in Iraq, which will cost this country dearly, the no rate, and if the previous Labour government had been more financially responsible, the coalition government would not now be having to bite the bullet and to pull back expenditure. The Labour Party nationally just gripe. They have nothing credible to say. It is time they woke up.
Yes, Davies. Please don't interrupt.
It is time they woke up to their responsibility and accepted their culpability for the current financial mess that they created. During the past few months, it has been good to see Labour locally working with the other parties. In this spirit, I would urge Labour to think again, reinstate the allocated funding, and try to restore faith in Wirral Council. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do believe that sometimes we get caught up in debating national issues a little bit too often in council, issues that we can very seldom affect. So, however, in relation to motion 1, I think I'll make an exception. Mr. Mayor, allow me to explain, for those who don't understand, how a structural deficit comes about. A structural deficit is when income, that's revenue or takings, does not equal your expenditure in an accounting year. To simplify it further, expenses greater than revenues equal deficit. Now this is different to a cyclical deficit, which may occur during recession. During this time, and in the case of a cyclical deficit, any borrowing needed will be repaid when the economy turns higher and there is a cyclical surplus. However, a structural deficit means that a deficit will be seen, hence national debt will be increased regardless of how the economy performs, even when the economy is performing to its full potential. We are as a council facing a difficult financial outlook. However, let us not forget that the need for public spending reduction has come about. A poor economic policy from the previous government had led to this. It's not just that the government was running at a national structural deficit. It's the fact that the Labour government continued to increase the structural deficit virtually year on year, with dramatic spending increases, even as we entered recession in 2008. We need to face up to the budgetary challenges ahead of us, but let's do it in an open and transparent manner, as the Leader of the Council alluded to earlier. Even while the current government make extremely difficult decisions to try to balance the books and get the economy back on track, the 100 million saving quoted in the Labour motion is not due to the governmental cuts, as stated. A 67 million needs to be found over the 3 years due to increased costs or expenditure. It's very different, George. This is where we need to be focusing our efforts to try to reduce this vast amounts of money, to get spiraling expenditure under control and to learn from mistakes made. I commend the capital programme review and the proposed restructuring with senior management. But let's ensure that we receive the savings needed from these and other future initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, just let me explain what's going on now. We're going to have Cllr Hackett next, and then Chris Jones, and then Darren, and then is that all? There's nobody else. We've got all of the seconders to come up as well, of course. Okay. Cllr Pat Hackett, then Cllr Chris Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Back in the real world, besides Iraq, I do think it's important from the outset that we set our stall out tonight in a frank and helpful way. The authors of the amendments opposite, in the last paragraph of the amendment, talk about transparency in the decision-making process, and that, of course, is to be welcomed. But for the record, Mr. Mayor, let us not forget when they were in power, I'm being frank with this, for the budget process, they brought in undemocratic private task forces, completely bypassing, did you not, the democratic structures and members of this authority. And last year, Mr. Mayor, budget process. I remember the resolution coming to scrutiny, demanding that cabinet members turn up with their options, with their budget options. And yes, when they took the reins of power on a temporary basis, no measures from cabinet came to that scrutiny committee. So, you know, let's be honest and open, and let's think where we come from. But, you know, we do hope this newfound openness by both the Tories and the Lib Dems will see them also opposing the fury of the savage coalition government cuts to this authority. I mean, well, you know, come on, at the end of the day, that's what's happening, and we can't ignore that, as some members have had tonight. And also that they help us challenge the unjust formula that gives an unfair advantage to those authorities in the south. Mr. Mayor, if I can be positive, it's good that they support a lot of the measures being introduced, but quite how they come to the conclusion, as they put in, that £100 million is not required as a result of government cuts, is beyond me. And maybe Councillor Rennie can get up and explain later. I certainly couldn't understand what Councillor Cox was on about before. And certainly Councillor Johnston just ignores it in his speech as if it's not happening. I'm sorry. I just do not see where they're coming from. We all know that members of this authority have a duty to set a legal budget that means radical, hard and palatable choices have to be made. And we sincerely hope we see more members involved in this fully through democratic structures and use scrutiny budget workshops we are engaged upon, as explained by the leader tonight. Not merely picking and choosing ones which they will support and grandstanding, as Councillor Foulkes mentioned before, to the public and in the press, which they're doing over neighbourhood funding, which, as explained, is on hold at the moment until we look at all the choices before us. And those choices will be determined by our priorities to look after the most vulnerable, the less well off, and all those struggling to make ends meet in our communities. And I hope that's the priority of all this council, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, to achieve this, and in the spirit of all party frankness and openness, a number of meetings, as I mentioned, have been organised, including the recent one at Wirral and a series of those scrutiny budget workshops that I mentioned. And it's encouraging, is it not, Mr. Mayor, that those members that wish to engage in the process attended and contributed in a positive manner to help with those deliberations. That was certainly the case at the budget, at the regeneration workshop. And I would not call that or those actions a star chamber, as Councillor Brighouse suggested tonight. Just to finish, Mr. Mayor, I hope that the senior members opposite can lead their members by example and ensure they express to them the importance of these continuing sessions for the good governance of this authority as we look to set the budget. And as they say in their motion, it will help improve the culture of the organisation. Let's hope we keep to their words over the coming months. Only time will tell. Thank you for that.
As it's getting on with this, we're going to have Councillor Chris Jones, then Councillor Sykes, Councillor Dodd, and Councillor Blakeley, and then I've been proposing that we then go on to the second 3 seconds, unless anybody else is desperate. Anybody desperate? No. Good. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just reading these amendments and listening to some opposition members here and to some of the special scrutiny workshops and the visioning event, makes me wonder whether it condemns the living here or entitled land. They seem to be in denial that it is their government who has slashed funding for their council, so that however the sums are done and however hard the officers of this council work, we are unlikely to be able to support the communities we represent in the way we as councillors would like. The Tories and Liberals here are obviously not willing to work fully with Labour to do the best we can for the people of Wirral, as they seem to want to rush back into spending money we don't have. There is a freeze on non-essential services while the review is being carried out, and this is sensible and necessary. Councillor Green says we're all in this together. I don't think so, and neither do most of the public that I speak to. Members opposite should be ashamed of themselves and start taking some responsibility, and let's all work together.
Wouldn't be lovely if they could all be as short and
current suspension on funding is said to be restricted to non-essential items. Therefore, neighbourhood funding must be seen as non-essential. Improving community safety is also seen as non-essential. Cleaning up children's play areas, non-essential. Improving pavements and access via drop curbs is also non-essential. According to the Wirral Council website, last summer, Wirral Council visited over 170 community groups and 250 events to talk to residents and find out what their priorities were, not the Labour Group's priorities, where in their local areas in order to develop individual neighbourhood plans. We're now meant to ignore these neighbourhood plans, turn around to our residents and say, sorry, your priorities aren't essential. The website continues. Since the beginning of July, people have been submitting applications for funding that could help to make those ideas reality. Does the administration not realise the work that has gone into this, not only by the hard-working council staff who run the area forums, but also by the residents of Wirral, who have spent their own time developing plans and applying for this funding, mostly not for themselves, but for the benefit of their community? To even think about removing this funding at this point in time is just a slap in the face of inclusive democracy in action. In the Wirral Globe on the 17th of September, the leader of the council said doing nothing would be grossly irresponsible, and that the comments made about reinstating neighbourhood funding is just cheap politics and not the mature debate we have been promised. And yet the mature politics he wants seems to involve a one-way street of government bashing from the Labour Group, and any balanced argument to the contrary is cheap and immature politics. As has already been highlighted tonight, the figure of £100 million that's often bounded about by the Labour Group is not due to government cuts, with 65 million of it needing to be found due to increased costs. Surely playing politics with the community groups of Wirral, while filling them with fancy figures to put the blame onto the government, is not conducive of a working together approach. Even the Labour Group amendment to this motion, the blame is firmly pinned on the government, and then goes on to blame the other groups in the council for poor budgetary practices. Anyone else is to blame, except for the administration, who actually are taking these decisions. The reality is that these figures are a challenge that this council has to face, and in order to do so, we have to develop a plan, backed up by a budget to deliver it. However, that is not the end of the challenge. This planned budget must then be followed and monitored to ensure success. Unfortunately, it is this step that seems to have been forgotten, leaving us with a potential overspend of 17 million this year. And now it is the communities of Wirral who will miss out. This money goes potentially to tackle fly tipping, the cleaning of our streets, community safety improvements, just to list a few of the initiatives in the firing line. Not to forget all the groups that need this money to carry on their good work in their local communities. It appears the money was promised and now it has been suspended, possibly to be withdrawn, because the administration can't keep the budget on track. The communities of Wirral should not suffer as a result. We cannot have funding decided on a case-by-case basis by the administration. This was community money set aside for the community to decide what it is used for. We need this transparency in decision-making, and we need to immediately reconsider this issue and return the money to our communities, to the people who work hard in their own time to make Wirral a better place for us all to live. And I hope the Labour Group can see that this is the right thing to do.
Okay, we're now going to go on to Councillor Dodd.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, the Tories still don't seem to have grasped just how serious and desperate a financial situation the council is in. Just before the council needs to make, is being forced to make, in fact, £100 million in savings as a result of the Tory government's cuts. The previous administration, led by Councillor Gerry, have left this council with a £17 million overspend. Now, bizarrely, I think, Mr. Mayor, Councillor Pat Hackett seems to blame this on the Iraq war and the price that gold reserves were sold at. But there's no mention, Mr. Mayor, of the rock bottom price that the Lib Dems sold out to the electorate. Sold out the electors, in fact, Mr. Mayor. And this truly was a moral contract carry on spending and spending regardless of the challenges facing the authority. Now, I don't know what planet it's on, Mr. Mayor, but it explains a lot about the budget setting process last year. Now, Tom Harney, Councillor Harney, says that it's important that we look forwards and not backwards. And I think, Madam Mayor, that's because if we do look backwards, then we will see that last year's budget set by Tom Harney and Councillor Jeffrey contained unrealistic income targets and savings that could never be realised. A budget, Mr. Mayor, that Councillor Sykes voted for. Now, I don't know if these two things, these two sort of aspects of the budget that have now come out were done on purpose, or if the former leader of the council was incompetent. But if he was still the leader, Madam Mayor, then I will be standing here tonight calling for his resignation. But luckily, Mr. Mayor, the good people of Wirral have already seen to this earlier this year. How the last budget was ever passed was legal, Mr. Mayor, I will never know. The challenge to balance the books is an enormous one, and I'm pleased, Mr. Mayor, that we have a strong and capable leader in Councillor Davies. Labour, Mr. Mayor, is making the difficult decisions needed to ensure that the council delivers a legal budget. The Tories and the Lib Dems are welcome to join us at any time, but they're also welcome to play party politics if that's what they want to do. But the public, Mr. Mayor, will not forget about their incompetence.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm proposing now to go on. Oh, sorry, how could I forget him? Councillor Blakeley.
I was just about to suggest our issue, but thank you for remembering me again. Mr. Mayor, I'm going to go back a few years because let's face facts that a few years ago this council introduced area forums. Area forums are developed to give people greater say, greater decision making, what goes on in this area. From that developed some funding, through neighbourhood funding, through different types of funding, and it grew year on year and year on year. And we as a council, of all parties, because we all supported area forums, of all parties, gave the people out there some local decision making. How do you want to spend your money? What do you want to spend it on? What's best? And I think that's right. I think that's the right thing to do. Hey, and let's not beat about the bush. I've not been a tremendous fan of area forums, and lots of people know that on all sides, all parties. But they work. Some are attending greater than others. Some have 4 attendants. Some have 200. Some have 3 or 4. You know, but at the end of the day, it's about saying to local people, we trust you to make the decisions that you think are right, and we're going to back that up with some funds so you can spend it where you think it should be spent to better the community you live in and work in to a degree. And what happens? A month ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago, we get an email. Unilaterally wiped out neighbourhood funding. Frozen, I said, not taken away, frozen. But suddenly wiped out from groups who had made applications for funding, who were then told, hey guys, sorry, you're not on anymore. Not for the time being, not until we see if we can balance the books, and then we'll look at whether we can put it back in. We'll look at whether we can put it back in there. I have to say, as a leader of council, Bill, in that one email that came from the chief executive, you wiped out years of trust and faith from the community. Wiped out in one move. You destroyed local communities who come to rely on that funding. You might well laugh, but when groups who rely on £500 or £600 a year can't have it and go to the wall, they're in tears. They provide the real stuff. You think it's funny? I'm glad you think it's funny. I'll make sure to tell them. I'll make sure you tell them. I tell people it's funny. Groups have become dependent on this funding, and to simply freeze it at such short notice is absolutely unbelievable. You've not even given an opportunity to make alternative arrangements. You've not given a chance to look elsewhere. memory, the funding for road safety, a chunk of that was devolved down out of the transport budget in order to give local communities that funding. It wasn't extra money, it was part of, for them to determine local road safety schemes. When you're saying, Steve, you know, we're getting it back, and I welcome the amendment later, which gives us that 20,000 back. But we've got 28,000 in Walton, Leeds and Silver, that's extra to that, that's been frozen. You know, this isn't 20,000 of that 28,000. There's 28,000 in our road safety funding in Walton, Silver, and Leeds, which has been frozen. Yeah, this is this year's money. This is this year's money. This isn't last year's money. We didn't spend some of the UD money last year, and that's been swallowed up as well into that. So I'm disappointed that and did ask the Chief Executive if last year's funding could be released. But now it seems it's all non-essential. All these community groups out there are non-essential to you, Cllr loss. Absolutely non-essential, all of them. You don't support them. You don't encourage them. They're non-essential. That's how they see it. So we've got more Lisa and Silver Massey, and I'm talking about that because I've got the figures for that. Somewhere around about £131,000 that this council is withholding. £131,000. And Mr. Mayor, I thought that, you know, budget policy framework was a matter of this council. And yet, without a meeting of this council, without all elected members being involved, the money was wiped out, frozen, put on the back burner, call it what you will. But the fact of the matter is, councillors did not get an opportunity until tonight to discuss that funding. I find it incredible, Mr. Mayor, and the residents of this borough should not be held to account for the administration's failure to manage the budget. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, we're now going to go on to the seconders, and assuming that we're not letting the seconders speak more than once, is that in this order I propose Ann McLachlan, Lesley Rennie, Gilchrist, and Stuart Kelly, and then we'll go on to the rise of reply, the two pleasers. Okay, so Ann McLachlan, Councillor McLachlan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I'm pleased to be seconding what is a really important motion, and I welcome the statement in our motion of a joint, responsible approach to budget setting. And I do so because the Improvement Board have requested a report to their November meeting, setting out how we will be meeting our financial challenges and how our decision-making processes will be clear and transparent. We believe we have made more than a good start on clear lines of communication and transparency in our financial monitoring process. The monthly budget monitoring reports to ensure elected members are fully informed as we go forward. Our prudent approach to controlling the in-year overspend by suspending all non-essential spending and carefully examining what can and can't be afforded. Whilst at the same time, we have embarked on a major consultation exercise with the public of Wirral, our community partners and all elected members, which with only 4 days left to go, is at a record return in terms of responses from the public. The special scrutiny workshops have been a very good example of working together with our officers to look at what we spend in our service areas and to engage in that wider scrutiny realm of informing the debate about what exactly our priorities should be. They've also been an exemplar of what we can do when we put our heads together and we set our politics to one side. However, the political reality is, Mr. Mayor, that we do face a £100 million shortfall in our budget over the next 3 years, a third of our base budget, and that is as a direct result of the policy of the Tory Lib Dem coalition government's decision to make local government a scapegoat in their fruitless quest to address the budget deficit. It's not working, Mr. Mayor, because we're now in a double-dip recession, and this coalition government's debt via borrowing, contrary to what we've heard from Councillor Hale this evening, is running at an all-time all-time high, and more than the previous Labour government could even have dreamed about. I want us to be very clear, Mr Mayor, that as we go forward and set our budget for the next 3 years, we do so in the face of a Tory Liberal government, your government, hostile to local government, with unrealistic estimates of what it takes to effectively deliver services to the public of Wirral. We, of course, will set a legal budget. We will act responsibly and within our financial allocations. But those tough decisions which will need to be made should be prefaced and will be by us at all times by ensuring that the people of Wirral understand that your government is responsible. That's why your assertion that 67 million of that £100 million does not need to be found is as a result of increased cost is disingenuous, to say the least. Trying to water down the scale of the cuts, attempting to infer that the figures are suspect or made up or plain wrong, won't work. Who would want to invent sums of such magnitude, and to what end? The Interim Director of Finance has been tasked with a root and branch review of this authority's finances. Progress is being made on producing a clear and transparent 3-year budget, and key milestones are being put in place to deliver this, including a zero-based budget exercise which will be completed by the end of October. We are determined, Mr Mayor, that we will be living within our means in a clear and open way. We will do that to serve the interests of the council taxpayers of Wirral and ensure that they get the very best value for money services that we can provide. Thank you.
Gerry.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, it's never really a good position to have to second notices of motion or amendments, because most of the things that clearly you want to say have probably already been said, but I've been frantically scribbling as the debate has gone on. And first of all, I did want to just draw attention to in the council tonight. Is that I remember at last council meeting, I think it was Councillor Adrian Jones who accused probably myself and members of our group of being tribalistic. Well, if there was ever any examples of tribalism here tonight, then perhaps you should lecture those in your own group. Councillor Foulkes clearly has learned nothing, and Councillor Darren Dodd clearly has an awful lot to learn, because their comments were completely linked with tribalism. But nevertheless, Mr Mayor, we certainly, everybody in this council chamber, understand that the position that we're in at the moment, and none of us at all are deluded about the challenges that we've got to face. And while we've all been working together, particularly to improve our corporate governance, linked inextricably with all that and everything that we certainly do in this council, is the challenges that are going to actually face us in relation to budget setting. And clearly it's always tempting, isn't it, to try to have a go at the government who's presently in position. And, you know, obviously, but you could even have resist tonight not to have a little go. And, you know, it does tempt me then, and you know, you mightn't believe this, but you mightn't believe it, but I was going to leave it alone, but clearly you brought it up. So let's actually look at why we are in this position. You know, Gordon Brown had his hands in the purse strings of the government's finances for years. I mean, you talked about Councillor Pat Williams was quite right when she talked about gold reserves being sold off for a pittance, basically. So, you know, it's all very well, but we are where we are. The coalition government are here in office, and they have to start setting the wrongs that you left behind us. So clearly, Mr Mayor, there is an awful lot that we would agree with in the notice of motion by Councillor Phil Davies, but clearly there are things which we don't agree with, and one of those clearly is the way that the suspension of neighbourhood funding has been tabled. It is clearly wrong to label local communities as being part of non-essential. I think that's an absolute insult to local people. And clearly, perhaps, Phil, next time you're talking in the Wirral Globe, it might be something that you'd like to address, because I've spoken to numerous people. Well, whichever local paper it may have been. Nevertheless, Phil, I really do think you need to explain to people transparency and openness, which, you know, we haven't seen, Phil. And it, you know, it really is quite disturbing while we're all trying to work together. And I'm not going to go into all the issues here because obviously I've only got 3 minutes and I've already got the green light. But nevertheless, those people, Phil, who I've just mentioned, who actually work within their local communities, probably an awful lot of those people don't really give a jot as to what goes on here in political debate. But what they do care about is when they look out of their windows at home and they see dog fouling on the pavement. They don't like taking their children into the parks because some of the parks are going to be dirty. And they don't like the fact that there are potholes in their road and fly tipping down the end of their street or their entry. These are the type of things, Phil, I have to say to you, that the neighbourhood funding was there to address. And I really think now that by actually you're saying you haven't removed it but you shelved it, then clearly those sorts of things which are then going to be shelved, they are clearly just the triggers which start to bring your community down and make the place look derelict, make it look dirty. And while there are people out there who are willing to work with us and with you to try and put these things right, then I really think it is quite outrageous for you to have actually suspended those. And perhaps, Phil, you know, you may be able to tell us then if they are only suspended or shelved, then when can I tell those people that are saying to me, we're going to have to stop the work that we promised you to do to help build this borough up? When can you promise me then that I can then again go back to those people and tell them that in fact their money will be reinstated at some point? And I certainly look forward to that. But to dismiss those people who work voluntarily within their communities for the betterment of all, not only with us, but also with our partner agencies, but also with our partner agencies, to dismiss them, then I have to say you dismiss them at your peril, Phil. And as I say, we are working closely with you, probably far closer than I was ever feeling comfortable with the Labour administration. And perhaps that's got something to do with the change in leadership at the top of the Labour Party. Perhaps. But nevertheless, Phil, you know, there has been a fresh approach. But again, you know, you were the former leader's deputy when all these, you know, terrible reports were coming out from independent people. So I'll give you the benefit of the doubt because I really do truly believe that you're trying to make this council work. But where we don't agree with you, Phil, we will certainly say so. And clearly we don't agree with you that you are punishing in the most cruelest way those local communities which you purport to represent. So clearly, Phil, I would ask you to think again on that one. Thank you.
Gilchrist.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Right when members finish having a chat.
Just Councillor Rennie. Just next speaker. Councillor Gilchrist.
I've been listening to key issues in the debate. One of them was about the budgets and whether they were realistic or not. I'm looking at the letters that were issued by the Director of Finance to the Council in March for our budget meeting. I noticed that, for example, that 1.2 million savings can be delivered from the letting of contracts. That was an assumption. It's actually an assumption common to both the Labour budget and the Conservative budget. A question was raised about the strategic change programme, about whether it was being monitored or not, whether it was being followed or not. I did notice, Mr. Mayor, that the Conservative budget suggested that £4.4 million might be available from the strategic change programme. But I have to say, if people are accusing anyone of constructing unrealistic budgets, the Labour budget proposed £5.4 million to be found from the strategic change programme. So it is possible to go through these measures looking at. Councillor Hackett, I believe, suggested there hadn't been any scrutiny. I was chair of Council Excellence at the time, and Council Excellence met on the 28th of February. And what we said in our resolution was, this committee considers it essential that monitoring of the budget is rigorous, that potential overspends are identified, and the Cabinet pays due regard to the implementation of policy options. We specifically stated that because we knew the underlying situation. And those of us who have been around for a long time know about some of the underlying situations, the need to make sure that budgets reflected what was actually being spent. It's been highlighted more recently by Mr. Timmins. The fact that some areas there was always an
tonight from Councillor McLachlan, there is a zero-based budget being drawn up. Not the only person drawing up a zero-based budget, because Ed Balls has now said that there will be a Labour zero-based budget should they have returned to power, and that they would still go back and look at every item of public spending and examine it rigorously. But of course we're then berated for who made the cuts, who was going to make cuts in the first place. And I'll finish with a quote from Andy Burnham from the Labour leadership debate in September 2010. We need to be honest about what would have happened in the public sector. We only guaranteed the front line of police, schools and the health service. We didn't give a guarantee beyond that, so let's be honest about that. That's the situation, Mr Mayor. We do not know what would have happened had the Labour government been returned with Gordon Brown. We would have faced the same serious situation. There's a debate about whether it's worsened or not, but the fact is in 2008 and 2009, local government officers were being warned that the party was over, that cuts were being made by future Labour government, it could be returned, that only certain areas were protected, and for that evidence, I just invite you to look at a letter last week in The Independent from a local government officer, perhaps known to one of our officers, an Adrian J.P. Morgan from Darwin in Lancashire, pointed out that in 2009, his council officers were asked to think the unthinkable, and that meant looking for substantial savings.
And Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The words institute a spending freeze on non-critical expenditure concerned me when the Cabinet agenda was published at the beginning of September, because there was no doubt that the Council's definition of what was non-critical will be different to my constituents' definition of what was non-critical. And I was right. I emailed the Interim Director of Finance for information on the 30th of August. I said I wanted to understand the impact of the recommendation, and could he advise me which capital schemes are paused and which areas of revenue expenditure are defined as non-critical. On the 24th of September, after chasing it up, I received a reply stating the Finance Department couldn't respond to individual requests. So the need for secrecy soon became apparent as we learned the Cabinet's definition of non-critical expenditure. 20 mile an hour zones, out. Neighbourhood funding, out. The £250 enhancement for low-paid employees, out. We also learned the definition of critical expenditure, expanding HR by £200,000. 3 new strategic directors at a potential cost of £300,000. And now I hear on the grapevine where to appoint a consultant to help define organisational values at God knows what cost. I'll tell you something, Mr Mayor, about the values of an organisation that freezes spending on road safety, low pay and community projects. Mr Mayor, it has no values. Mr Mayor, I recall an episode of Westminster in the dim and distant past where Jim Hacker tours a hospital that provides absolutely no services but still employs lots of well-paid people because there are skilled, essential administrative tasks to be done. At this rate, Mr Mayor, we will have a Westminster Council where money can only be allocated to carry out essential administrative functions. Mr Mayor, we do not accept that community groups should bear a share of the paying. We as the Council have raised expectations, we have asked for submissions against the budget line agreed by the Council, and those submissions have come forward in good faith. We have entered what Councillor Johnston rightly calls a moral contract. We'll go back to the issue that has been least debated, and that's the old chestnut of the enhancement for low-paid employees. We couldn't do a motion on that because it only came to light, only came to my attention, after the deadline for submission of motions and amendments. We would certainly have highlighted that as another moral contract broken, this time with the low-paid. I'm sure the low-paid will understand that whilst they're classed as non-critical expenditure, Labour decides to appoint further managers into HR and into the Directorate. There was a time, Mr Mayor, when a Labour politician would happily lose a limb, a non-critical limb possibly, or a limb they were worth, rather than agree to that juxtaposition to their values. Now, however, Mayor, we have witnessed their national leader, Miliband, attempt to claim the mantle of Disraeli's One Nation conservatism, and we're within our rights to ask what values do Labour have left. But who is, Mr Mayor, the true successor to Disraeli? Is it Ed Miliband or is it David Cameron? Mr Mayor, for my part, I'll stick with the analysis of the Liberal leader and Prime Minister William Gladstone of the time, when he described Disraeli as all show and no substance. Mr Mayor, how apt that Labour should seek to be like Disraeli. In terms of the amendments tonight, we need to have these priorities. We should ask Cabinet to restore the community funds, to think again about road safety and to get its priorities right.
Thank you. Okay. Now the right to reply. Councillor, you would exercise your right to reply?
Yes, please. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And always, I'm glad I didn't nip out while you were on this time, Stuart. It's very entertaining.
You like being house, Stu?
Yeah. So, Mr. Mayor, I did want to respond take a very short time to respond, because again, I think Lesley was right about this. We have tried to help, we have tried to support, but of course, it seems to me, certainly seems to me, that because we've been doing that, we just seem to be getting abuse from the Labour Party. It seems absolutely astonishing. And again, as I pointed out to you at the time, it appears as though the Labour Party don't listen, and we should have known that. The figures for what's the reduction in grants against what's the likely increase in expenditure, comes from Mr. Timmins, and I'm sure it's available to you if you would care to ask. And what we said at the very outset is, yes, we want to help, yes, we want to work with you if we possibly can. But that needs to start from a point of honesty and clarity. And again, I just have to say, Anne was a very, very good speech. I didn't agree with all of it, but a good speech. And we're talking about, which I think you did an impressive job in improving governance within the authority and so on. But then we're told about this openness and transparency. And then choose to announce there's a zero-based budgeting going on. This is all being done in an open and inclusive way. Certainly the first time I've heard about it, and I don't know about anyone else within the council. So I think we might have missed the transparency point a little. Telling people what's been done is not the same as engaging, involving people while you're doing it. And that's what we mean about openness, transparency, and engagement. And I must say, it was great to hear from Steve again. Councillor Foulkes again. It appears as though that sort of side of the Labour Party, that lumbering side that sort of fails to accept that they did everything wrong or ever apologise for making any mistakes, still exists. I'm surprised at the number of echoes of that as you went through the Labour Party's contribution. And so, in a way, I can understand what Phil's doing in terms of the publicity and what he's trying to do. He's trying to create a burning platform that his own Labour group will realise they have to change their way and make some decisions. And I can understand that, but I do hope that you'll deal with honesty. Just to start with that, we heard about these unreasonable income targets that were being set. I think Steve was going about. So just looking at the Labour Party's own strategic change programme, which you implemented in September and still have refused to let me see the minutes of about how that was done. You say, B, income. The 1 million additional saving each year is